Welcome to today's webinar. The topic is Making the Invisible Visible with EMG with Dr. Eric Pepper. Dr. Pepper is an international authority on biofeedback and self-regulation. Since 1970, he has been researching factors that promote healing. He is a professor of holistic health studies in the Department of Health Education at San Francisco State University. He is president of the Biofeedback Foundation of Europe and past president of the Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback. He holds Senior Fellow Biofeedback certification from the Biofeedback Certification Institute of America. He was a behavioral scientist, sports psychologist for the United States Rhythmic Gymnastics team. Dr. Pepper has a biofeedback practice at Biofeedback Health with the website. I can send that right in the chat right now. And Dr. Pepper's research interests focus on self-healing strategies to optimize health, illness prevention, the effects of posture and respiration, and learning self-mastery with biofeedback. So welcome, Dr. Pepper.
Eunice, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some concepts about electromyography and making the invisible visible. I'm Eric Pepper, as I said. I'm in the Institute for Holistic Health Studies. And probably most useful for anyone who's looking at this is look at my blog called www.pepperperspective.com that has many articles focusing on these topics on holistic health, also even on electromyography. You just need to search through it. And if you have questions, you can just contact me by email, which is also listed there, eric.pepper@gmail.com. With that note, basically, I would say, if I think about it, if I would love to know from each of you, before I talk about EMG, what is your experience with electromyography? My experience is what? I use it with patients, or I don't know anything about it. Eunice, what is your experience with EMG?
So I've mostly used EMG with me and my coworkers since I test most of the Thought Tech equipment. So I've used it in partial activities, but not with clients. But Bertrand noted in the chat that she's an OT and she's used SEMG with patients in stress management and stroke rehab.
Great. Okay, so what I will then do is I'll try to keep that in mind. What I will do is I'll define a bit what is EMG for those who don't know, how you can use it. It's the history, where it starts from, and probably three different concepts which can be applied to everyone. And that is the concept of dysponesis. That means misdirected efforts. It really means that many people are unaware that they tighten muscles in activity. They're unaware they co-contract inappropriately. They often are unaware they don't let the muscles go. Then there's the concept of learned disuse. Learned disuse is the concept that we may have had an injury and then we learn to adapt without knowing and not use certain muscle groups. And I think that fits very well in OT and physical therapy, but also in psychotherapy. And then we'll talk about for a moment an assessment protocol by Gabe Sella, which I think would be very good. And then a few areas of clinical applications. Why do you want to use EMG? It's interesting in the field of biofeedback and neurofeedback. EMG was very much in the foreground in the early 1970s and in the 1980s and early 90s. It was applied to many different clinical applications with very good success. And then that whole area faded out even in publications. And then the movement went to respiration, heart rate variability, and EEG. And yet EMG is so useful. It's one of the most pragmatic tools I can think about. EMG can show how mind-body is connected. It measures covert, I'm going to use that word very strongly, covert tension. It's also something that patients can really understand very quickly. It's obvious. This is a muscle you tighten or you don't tighten. And so many patients don't know or are unaware that they may be contracting muscles in a task. They're totally unaware that they are not relaxing the muscles. And they're also totally unaware, and many therapists there, the muscles have really two components, if you think about it. One is the voluntary control. That's obviously maybe tighten, like I lift my arm, I tighten my biceps or my triceps or whatever I may be doing, the specific muscles. Those are the motor units contracting. And then that is under voluntary control. Then our muscles are also interactive with our involuntary nervous system, and that is via the trigger points. These Trigger points are areas in the muscle that's often felt as a tiny, kernel of rice almost. Many people may feel it in their neck. If you go to your trapezius, you have this maybe tender spot. If you go to the scalene muscle on the side, you press in here, it feels achy and it gives referred pain. The trigger points are not under voluntary control. I want to underline that. And they are related to the sympathetic system. And when you reduce sympathetic arousal or sympathetic activity, then the trigger points get quiet. So you can, paradoxically, your muscle can be totally relaxed. I want to underline that. And yet the trigger point that often causes referred pain can be active if one is sympathetically active or worrying, etc. So keep that in mind. So in a sense, muscles is just slightly more than just learning to relax the muscles. It means also quieting our whole autonomic nervous system. But it's really one of the most powerful tools I know of to both do diagnostics in a way, and as a tool, as a teaching tool to help clients, recover or regain control or resolve a number of disorders. They can range from tension headaches to urinary incontinence. And one of the major issues that faces many of us is, how do you know that you have tension? I mean, that's strange. Most of us are really unaware that we have tension, and let me give an example for a study. And this comes from the work that we have done with physical therapists. And when you normally ask a therapist, can you identify whether the person has tension or not? They would say yes in their muscles. But physiologically, when you monitor, you realize they probably do not. So let me show you an example of one of these little simple awareness studies. Because if you are not aware of tension, then you cannot intervene. Let me give an example, okay? Before doing that. What I'd like you all to do is imagine you need to thread a thread through the eye of a needle. So what you do is you're holding your hand an imaginary needle. Ideally, it should be a real one. There's a tiny eye there. Now you take a thread, you now wet it, and now you very carefully push it through the eye. So do that for a moment. Really make it real. So in your hand, hold the needle, wet the thread, put it through the eye of the needle, really do it. And as you're doing that, are you aware that you were holding your breath? You tightened your shoulders. You may have not even blinked. All these were unaware till either I pointed it out to you or you were reminded. It is possible to do many tasks without excessively tightening your shoulder. Many people, when they did this, they automatically raised their shoulder. They went like this. They may have clenched, or little kids even stick their tongue out when they concentrate. All that is unnecessary tensions of which they're unaware. It's not a big problem. It may be a very big problem if you do this habitually and then you don't relax after. And we are really not very aware of muscle tension. So let me now show you an example of a little study where we showed that phenomena, how we may not know it. Here's a phenomena you see many people do working at the computer, right? As their hands are on the computer, they're waiting at the keyboard, their hands may be lifting above the keyboard, they may be pausing, etc. They do this all the time. And then at the end, they may get neck and shoulder tension. Again, they have no idea why. Sometimes people would talk about carpal tunnel or other issues, but in many cases, it may be because of excessive tension. So in this study, we did something very simple. We monitored the muscle tension on the forearm, which just like here's the EMG, here are the electrodes placements for a moment. Those are called wide placements. This looks at any of the extensors. You don't know whether it's the pinky or the index finger, the ring finger, but any of them would lift up. Then you ask the person, and you may all want to do this for a moment, put your hand just on the desk, and now just lift your hand up. Keep the wrist on the desk and lift your hand up till you feel the first level of tension in your forearm. What is the lowest level you recognize? Okay? You got that, and then let it go. And so that's what the study was about. And now you can see and then you can look at the blue line here, and you can see that when they were relaxed, there was almost no tension. Some people still had some more tension. You see in the blue in their forearm, even when they thought the arm was relaxed. Then they lifted it. And now they said, I now feel the tension, just the minimum tension. I want to underline. They now became aware of their minimum tension. Before that, they didn't know there was any tension. And then you let the hand drop to the table again the same way, or relax the wrist, and you see the post measure. And what you now can see very eloquently, then we train the people with biofeedback. Now they look at their own muscle tension level. And as they're looking at the feedback, they can now try to lift the arm a bit and let it go, lift it. So now they can learn to become aware of a lower level of tension. And what is interesting, there are two parts of this. One, when they now rest their hand on the table, the muscle tension in the forearm is lower. I know this doesn't look like a very big difference in the pre-relax, the blue versus the red. It looks almost insignificant. But it's similar to driving your car with your handbrake on. It is just a tiny bit of tension. The error we often make is we think that, in order to have a problem, I need to have a lot of tension. In fact, the research data may not support that totally. It may be just a slight increase in tension is one of the major issues. And I would argue, and our research data seems to support that none of the therapists would notice this difference with a patient. So these are all PTs, by the way, these 34, they're all physical therapists. And they would not know, and although this is their own data, that this very low level of tension they had here in the pre-relaxed state before training was in fact some muscle tension in the forearm. But note that in a very short training epoch, it's really very short, by the way, they could drop their awareness. They could increase their awareness by almost 50%. Before that, they were about 17 to 18 microvolts. That's a measure of muscle tension. After training for that very short time, they could go to 9. You can even go lower than that. It takes more training. We did. And then afterwards, without any feedback notice, they could do it very well. And that's, it's really impressive. And what did they observe? And I think this is the useful part. This is it's when you do this kind of work with clients as well. They realized and that's only for some of them, not everybody. I only had to think to lift my hand and my muscles reacted. I didn't realize that muscle tension occurred without visible movement. I think that is the most important lesson to look at. Because when the person had their hand on the table, when they tightened the muscles slightly, there was no visible movement for themselves or people looking at the arm. And then as a physical therapist, I was shocked that I was unaware of my muscle activity. The muscle activity went up before I felt anything. And just anticipating the thought of lifting my hand increased the muscle activity. And this is the real key. After training, I could feel the muscle tension. And it was 1/3 lower than before I started. Now, you could say, well, this is a nice little study. What's the use of that? Really, the key of this kind of awareness is that now during the day, I could become more aware. If I did this in my trapezius muscles, the ones that we often, when we get slightly vigilant, the world is no longer safe. I tend to tighten a tiny bit, but very little, only 2 or 3 microvolts, nothing very much, just a tiny bit. And I hold that tension and I don't ever relax. That's the key. So the next level out of this data is that health of muscles is not just that you can tighten or feel it, is that there are episodic moments of letting the muscle relax. But let me point out a few more of this. I could argue, what are some of the benefits of muscle biofeedback? I want to outline this. One, it's obvious to the person. It matches their subjective experience. I clench my jaw. These muscles, masseter, temporalis, they tighten. I can let it go. I raise my shoulders and I can let it go. I can see it, I can feel it. And then it shows, especially when you go at these levels where you're unaware, how much thoughts affect your body. And those are individual differences. For some people, let me do a detour. There's a principle enunciated by Elmer and Elise Green called the psychophysiological principle, in which you say every thought and emotion has a corresponding body activity and vice versa, the same way. And so, in that sense, for many people, when they worry, when they think, their body tightens. And so it's a great connector between cognitive therapy, because you can now see when you start worrying, you start ruminating, you start thinking negative thoughts, your muscles or your body reacts. It makes an impact. On the other hand, if you can quiet the body, then the brain has to be quiet. You could say the following in a very simplistic way. There are many approaches for meditation or body relaxation. If the body is totally relaxed, the brain is quiet. If the brain is totally quiet, the body is relaxed. It probably is best associated with fear. But remember, muscle biofeedback has a much broader range than just relaxation. But let me go back to the benefits. It can really identify whether the person can relax a muscle, or when we have the thought, are they relaxed? And so anyone who teaches progressive relaxation or muscle relaxation or something like that, where the EMG will be the item that can truly identify if the muscle is totally quiet. Remember, when a muscle is not being used, there should be zero motor unit activity, no muscle contractions at all, even if you don't feel it. It can also help identify when we co-contract activities. And I think it's a great tool to combine with homework practices such as progressive relaxation or any of the muscle tension relaxation. So let me summarize for a moment the service electromyographic applications. One, I've pointed out awareness. Two, it can be done for assessment, which muscles you go contract unknowingly or you don't relax. That's very critical, and that's often related to pain, especially after a muscle tightens. Does it really let go? The sense of co-contraction. There's this part that I call the reversal of learned disuse. This is especially used again in physical therapy. It's most obvious there, like for women who have urinary incontinence. A large component of urinary incontinence has been called stress incontinence. That occurs when the pressure of the abdomen on the bladder is higher than the sphincter ability to contract. Therefore, as the pressure in the abdomen increases, like during a cough or whatever, or a tennis swing, the person will leak a little bit of urine. And this can get worse for a number of women as they get older. And incontinence, stress incontinence is a major issue with some older women. It's more likely after that women who have had childbirth. And the reason is the overwhelming process of that is the process called learned disuse. Now, what is that? How does that work? Well, the person gave birth. They may have had an episiotomy. It hurt. And so after birth, the person unknowingly, and I want to underline that, learned not to tighten the pelvic floor muscles, because when you do that, it hurts. So if you did a Kegel exercise for a woman, then they would tighten these muscles after birth. It would hurt. Unknowingly then, the person, because of the injury for a moment, the tearing or whatever was going on, they felt pain, almost like classical avoidance conditioning. They avoided tightening. This is their new normal. And when this now becomes the new normal, they increase their risk of urinary incontinence as they get older. There's a great electromyographic feedback approach, which is really remarkable. It's old, from the 1980s. There's nothing new about this. In this, at least the well-trained pelvic floor therapists, what they would do is they have the woman insert a sensor, which is a muscle sensor, in the vaginal area. Now they ask the person to do a Kegel exercise. That means you tighten the pelvic floor muscles, and now they can see on the screen that they're doing it. And what you see in a number of the women who have urinary incontinence, when you give them that instruction, at best you see a slight flick or nothing. Wait a minute, but they're saying they're doing it. So subjectively, they're saying, I am doing the exercise. However, the physiology doesn't show it. What they're doing often, maybe they may be tightening their buttocks, they may be tightening their stomach. So they are unaware exactly which ones to use because they have learned not to use it. With EMG feedback, now they can see it on the screen. Now they explore ways by which they can reactivate those muscles. They then learn to do that. And in between 4 and 6 training sessions, you can have an 80% success rate, which is remarkable because really, these muscles were just disconnected in a way by avoidance learning of pain. You can see this in many other parts in the body as well. So that concept of learned disuse is really very useful. And that goes to the whole area of physical rehabilitation. But many other areas, it can be used for tension, headaches, backaches. I already talked about incontinence, relaxation, etc. We'll go back over the list much more. But before going on, let me talk a bit about the history and the recording, and then I'll do a few applications or thoughts. Remember that muscle biofeedback was already done in the 1930s, and one of the first persons who ever used this and used muscle recording with needle electrodes was Edmund Jacobson, the father of progressive relaxation, who used this to observe that people could really be relaxed. Then in the 1960s, there was a bigger increase by Marinamachi, who in Los Angeles used muscle feedback, that's recording from the muscles, to work with patients who had strokes, who had spinal injuries, etc., to allow rehabilitation. Then in the 1970s, basically late 1960s, 70s, it moved into the world of biofeedback more, with Thomas Budzinski doing the first work on tension headaches using frontal feedback from the frontalis, putting electrodes on the forehead, monitoring the muscle tension, and then teaching the person to inhibit that tension. Well, if you can really relax your face totally, it's hard to have thoughts or emotions. So in a way, you teach the person to inhibit their thoughts and learn to relax. He did something more. He combined that also with kind of progressive relaxation homework exercises. Then at the same time, a very useful model was presented by George Watmore and Coley on dyskinesis. I'll talk about that later. And an assessment for how to assess muscle activity. And the applications then in the 1980s, in the many published articles are tension, headaches, chronic pain, TMJ, relaxation, subvocalization, urinary incontinence, anxiety, asthma, etc. So there are many, many applications one can look at. But for those who are totally new or may not know about muscle biofeedback, let me for a moment detour and explain what is electromyography, and then we'll go on. Here we are. Basically, a surface electromyography monitors the electrical activity from the skin, which measures the electrical activity produced by the muscles when they contract. This signal is produced by the motor units. A motor unit is that subset of a striate muscle. It may have multiple striate muscle cells. It's innervated by just one single motor neuron. And what Jombas-Machen did, and early even Harrison did, but they showed that when you put a needle electrode in the muscle, it would then monitor those motor units. And then people could have voluntary control when they saw the feedback of motor units. What that then means, and it just blows my mind, you're controlling voluntarily a single motor neuron. From the billions of neurons you have, somehow you can learn that voluntary control. And the control is even more. You can learn to even inhibit that motor unit when normally would be co-activate. And when you start seeing that and you see that work, then you say, we can have more control than we want. Okay? And just to keep in mind, when you record from the surface, it's always the area underneath it, the volume underneath it. So you don't even quite know which muscle it totally is. Sometimes you'd have to use fine wire electrodes in a muscle. But for most psychologists and almost most people who use surface electromyography, they wouldn't use needle electrodes. They would use surface electrodes, which measures an area. But what is so interesting in this history, I'm shifting back to history, is that electromyographers, those are physicians who used EMG to do diagnostics of neurological or muscular illnesses. They used biofeedback for years without knowing. Because when they would put needle electrodes in and they would do nerve stimulation, then they could figure out and do diagnostics. And often, if there were too much muscles tightening, they couldn't see the signal. They would always tell the person, basically, relax, get less noise on the screen. However, they did not realize that they were doing biofeedback, and that same technique could then be used to teach people from the surface and teach them voluntary control. That was the big shift that happened in the 1970s in biofeedback. And so I say, but I want to underline, and this is the most important part, there's no activity, electrical activity, when the muscle is relaxed. But when people talk about muscle tone, that may be the fascia, but it's not, but the muscle is relaxed, there's no activity at all. If I look at a very simple diagram for a moment like this, here you can see here are two electrodes, and you can see these kind of, clumps on are different muscles. They produce an electrical signal, and the signal is monitored between the two electrodes. And then the height of that signal depends a little bit how far the muscle is away from the skin. So keep in mind that the absolute value, between people can change a bit because the muscle, some people have more fatty tissue underneath the skin than others. And remember, the signal that is produced, I want to underline again, is a motor unit, the functional part of a striate muscle innervated by a single motor neuron. And it really depends. Each motor unit has different number of striate muscle cells. The ones in the eyes have very few, some of the quadriceps or have many. But they're all just innervated by one neuron, and you can control it. Here's the biceps, for example. You look at that, within the biceps, it's innervated. The muscle is innervated from the anterior horn, the spinal column. Here goes the motor nerve. It then goes, notice it's one of these motor neurons innervates a number of striate muscle cells. As illustrated here is motor neuron number 1. That's the red ones. Motor neuron 2 is the blue ones and the gray ones. And when a muscle contracts, these all go on, off, on, off, on, off, but together they apply the force, and that's what you feel. And what I said earlier is you can literally teach the person not to tighten motor unit 1. You can have it hit motor unit number 3 and say, I want to tap it at this rhythm, tighten, 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 tighten. And the other one you can do is, boom, boom, boom. It is remarkable that people can do this. They're controlling single neurons. So that's the background of this. If I go back here, if you recorded that, you would get this little spike. That's the motor units potential. Remember, that's from in this case, from the triceps. Here you have many going. It's a similar kind of pattern. And what really happens for human beings is that here you record from the surface of the skin. Here is the signal. That's not how we normally look at it. We look at something called the raw. We don't look at the raw signal. We look at an average of muscle power. And that's what usually we see with EMG. So you don't no longer see the individual motor units. You just see a summation of the electrical activity. And that's what people then can control. Okay, you can put the electrodes almost anywhere. You could put them very close together, then it's the area just underneath, or even wide apart. If you put the electrodes wide apart, like on the trapezius, or often we use a scalene to trapezius, which is for breathing. If you do that, then in fact, you don't know what you're measuring. I should not say that, but you're measuring a kind of signal of all of them. It's a very useful way to monitor an average level of tension. So if you have only one channel, you put the electrodes far apart. If the person raised their right shoulder without awareness, it would show. If they raise their left shoulder, it would show. If they breathe in their chest, it would show. I think that is the major part, what you can easily see when that occurs. And it can really identify, like I said again, the lack of awareness, excessive co-contractions, and the part of exercise. But let me do a little practice with each of us, okay? Before we go on, because I want to point our awareness. So what I'd like you all to do is just stand up. Just stand up. Just like, let the arms just hang along the side of the body. Let it be relaxed. And now where your palm, if the palms are almost touching your thighs, but they're still relaxed. And now what I'd like you to do is to move your palms a ½ inch away from your thighs to the side. So you abduct your arms a ½ inch away from your thigh, almost minimally, almost none, but just enough that the palms are moving away from the side of your thighs by a ½ inch, no more. Just do that. And let it full come back. Do it again. Lift, let it go back. And what did you experience? Most of you would then notice, if I asked you, where did you feel the tension? Most people would be unaware that they feel tension almost anywhere. It's a rare person who would really be able to identify this. But now I'm going to make your fingers your own biofeedback machine. Put your hands right on your shoulder like this. That is right over the deltoid, not on top of the shoulders, just over the deltoid. Let the deltoid feel soft to you. Really feel soft. And now initiate that movement of a ½ inch, abducting the arm that's hanging down. And then let it plop back again. Do it again. Abduct it and let it go down. You stand with your arms hanging down, like I said before. You abduct your arms just a ½ centimeter away. You feel the area, then relax. Then you bring your hands back, so the picture would look like this. And then you feel it. And I think each of you would have felt that now, to your own surprise, you could feel how much the muscle, the deltoid, is tightening when you abduct. Intellectually, if you know kinesiology, you know that muscle has to tighten. However, we do not feel it. Most people are unaware. So this is where we can use our fingers to feel that movement. We can also use electromyography to do that. And we publish this as an article. And now you can see very nicely, here you are relaxed. There's zero muscle tension. Notice it's not totally zero. It's 0.2 in this case or so, because there's always some external noise the sensors are picking up depending on the filters. Here the person tightens and then they relax. Here they abduct the arm again and they relax. And notice this is a healthy muscle because the muscle tightens like a square wave. There's tension there and then drops right away, and there's no other tension here. And I think that it's really very useful to see. It's hopefully a demonstration you experienced to show, my muscle activity, that I'm unaware of muscle activity, and EMG could then be very useful to look at that. So let me do a few diagnostic pieces of EMG as well, because it's very helpful to know how the person is working, and it's some critical issues. So one, here we have it again. The person tightens the muscle, holds, and drops it. Notice that's a well-trained, healthy muscle. This could be the shoulder. I bring the shoulder up and let it drop. This could be the arm. As a therapist, you lift a person's arm up, or they lift it, and then they just let it fall. Many patients, that's not the case. They do something different. They may have a difficulty turning the muscle on. They can't quite hold the tension, but more importantly, when they let go, they don't quite let go. Notice it starts at a higher level. The muscle is always under tension. And that, I think, is a major, major problem. Here you can see, here's a good example. Here's a bad example. Notice the muscle is relaxed, but when the person lets go, it doesn't quite relax. Yet the person will say, I have relaxed the muscle. That is the distinction. Okay? But remember, the stress has an overlaying component, which is your reactivity and recovery. This is a very old study, but I think it's critical to think about. This is working at the computer. You're monitoring the trapezius, the upper trapezius. So the bottom line, the lower, the black line, is sitting with your hands on your lap. The next line, just evoking stressful imagery. Notice the shoulders. For most of us, the shoulders, you would not notice that change. It's only a few microvolts, maybe 1, 2, 3 microvolts. Some people, yes, they tighten a lot. Most people don't. Most people, it's almost imperceptible. I often see just a slow increase. That's when they're thinking stressful imagery. And now the next part is even more important to keep in mind. It's how we use our muscles. Now we have the person do data entry, they type. Notice the muscle activity has to increase. It doesn't have to, because their arms technically should be hanging down, but when the person works, they bring their arms forward. They may want to stabilize their shoulders. They tighten the trapezius. But notice, which is the critical part, notice every so often you have these momentary EMG drops. Those are called EMG gaps. So as the person is working, every so often they drop their, without any awareness. That's the key. They are not aware they're doing this. They relax the muscle. When you feel happy, healthy, not threatened, then you can do that. Because now you can just work, but there's no threat, there's no urgency. You can work very productively and you let the muscle just go. However, when you feel threatened, when you're vigilant, you're anticipating, then you have to always be on guard. And now when you work, you get the last line. Notice, yes, it looks like it's much higher. In numbers, that is not really that important. Now they're typing with a stressful mental imagery. Yes, the muscle tension is slightly higher. That may not be the case always. The most important part that happened is that these small breaks, the recovery breaks, disappear. Notice? And if you don't have these recovery breaks, then you get exhausted, then you get pain, then the muscle slowly has troubles. Let me do this by a little experience for all of you, how important those micro breaks are. As you're sitting right now, you're all sitting, I presume. What I'd like you to do as you're sitting is just lift your right knee slightly upward away, so your foot is about an inch away from the ground. Just lift your foot an inch up away from the ground. Notice not very much. It's not too much. The foot is just hanging downward, but it's not touching the floor. And observe what you feel in your hip. You can feel the hip flexor starting to tighten. Depending how long I do it, it may even get achy right now, I presume. You can feel that, correct? Yes. And remember, when a muscle is held tight this way, when the muscle tension is about 20%, it cuts the blood flow through the muscle by probably 80%. And how long can you hold the knee up? You may also have stopped breathing, by the way, but how long? Well, it probably depends how much I want to pay you. But let the leg just relax. Feel the letting go sensation. You can even shake it a bit, possibly. Notice you could not hold the leg up for a long time. And the reason you could not hold it up, because it was held under tension the whole time. And there were no regenerative breaks or EMG gaps. And you can experience the difference because when you walk, many of you can walk for miles. And when you walk with each swing of the leg going forward, then you would activate that same muscle. You would activate it. And then as the leg goes forward, then it would relax. As the leg goes back, it alternates. So it continually tightens and let go. And when you continually tighten and let go, the muscle can function very well for a very long time without any exhaustion. Because during the tightening phase, you're blocking lymph and blood flow. And during the relaxation phase, you allow the lymph and the blood flow to go around to be replaced. And so this is a critical issue. So notice there are two components. One, psychological stress, especially in the dimension of vigilance and fear, would activate the muscles slightly, as done the lower, but more importantly, it takes the brakes away. With two parts, okay? And I want to talk for a moment about the concept of dysponesis, which I think is critical. What is dysponesis? Dysponesis means wrong, faulty bonus of work. It's a physiopathological state of errors in expenditure of the nervous system which cause the muscles to contract. The key is, as I pointed out earlier, when the arms go to the side slightly, when I get vigilant, I slightly brace my shoulders, I may hold my breath or whatever. But they're usually covert and they're often not noticed by the person making them or the person observing. The concept was developed by George Watmore and John Coley in 1975. It's a great book, difficult to read. The concept applies to all psychotherapy, I think. And what they really look at is they monitor the body on 8 simultaneous locations with EMG. And then they analyzed which muscles were active and how they worked. And so they identified performing efforts. That is the muscle you need to use, the activity you need to use to do the task. If I lift my hand up, my biceps need to tighten, to contract so my arm can come up. I may even need to, depending on what I'm doing, my deltoid or other muscles in the shoulders may need to tighten to stabilize it or give me. Sometimes people do excessive performing efforts. They try too hard. Remember when you look at little kids or when you learn to write and they get the finger cramps holding the pencil? Well, they're holding the pencil. However, their performing efforts are much too high. They're unaware of that usually. They need to learn to inhibit that. EMG is a great way then to show that. Then there are bracing efforts. Bracing efforts means you hold your body rigid to attack. It's often part of the fight-flight response. So if you do the flight-fight response, you tend to pull your shoulders a tiny bit in, your hands, your knees come together, the Achilles muscles tighten, but they're not necessary in most cases. There's no real tiger there. And we do this often during the day, with the efforts now pitted against each other, the agonist against the antagonist. And here we need to learn to have the person be aware that they are tightening these muscles, because every thought they have, that be fearful, would evoke those muscles. If you do this a lot, it's no wonder that people can get neck, back, and shoulder pain. Then there are representing efforts. We already talked about that. When you think, you evoke it. And then we do all our attentional efforts. We try too hard to look. Oh, I'm looking at the screen right now. All those attentional efforts, and they are a big cost. The underlying concept of this is really, it's reversible. And how do you do this before doing this? You have to diagnose it. So I use the EMG on the different muscles. You have them do a task, whether it's meant serial sevens, whether it's having the person sit and stand. And then you observe that and you identify those muscles which are not necessary for the task. You then teach them to inhibit that. That's the critical part, okay? You may just think about how many of us don't go when we can't quite read, we start squinting and going like this. The squinting may be useful because, slightly affect the eye. We may be able to see better. The cost is very high, except we're often totally unaware. We often tighten our neck when we get up, we're unaware. EMG can be very helpful to do that. So now let me give an example, doing something, using some of these concepts in a various piece working at the computer. Here's a person working at the computer easily. You see they're just working, and now we just monitor them while doing a task. Okay, we're monitoring their breathing pattern. We're monitoring their deltoid trapezius. So we put the electrode from the deltoid to the trapezius, and we monitor the forearm extensors. Now the person puts their hand on their lap. No problem. Notice the muscle tension is at this point really zero for the forearm, totally zero. There's some activity in the deltoid, and the reason is it's measuring this very broad area, so you get the electrical noise of the trunk as well, but the heart a little bit. All that gives a background level of noise, but this will be nearly zero. You could say the person is sitting quietly and relaxed. Now, all you do is have the person bring their hands to the keyboard. And notice that all of a sudden, all these are individual differences. Some people do this much more than others, but this is fairly common with most people. And what you see in the deltoid trapezius muscle activity, unknowingly, well, do you see this spike in both cases because the person lifted their hand up, that took effort. They put it on the keyboard. Now they're supposed to relax. And notice the muscle tension stayed up. It didn't go down. Look at it. It stays up slightly, not much, a little bit. They are totally unaware of that tension. That is the key. Then this very similar way as you look when they're typing. They're totally unaware that their shoulders are up the whole time. And then finally, let them rest. And when they rest, they don't recover. If you do this a lot, this person, when you look at that, will most likely develop ache and pains when they work after a while because their muscle does two things. That's what the usefulness of EMG is. It makes the invisible visible. It showed the person had tension when they were unaware. It showed their muscles never relaxed in doing the task, so they get exhausted. And it showed that after tightening, their muscles don't quite relax. As you see, rest at the keyboard, their muscles stayed slightly tense. Well, that is just like the exercise we did lifting the knee. So let me give an example what happens and how it can also be used in different ways. Here's a clinical case. I think that maybe summarize it. It's more in the physical therapy domain, but really it applies to anything. This could be jaw tension. This could be headaches. It makes no difference. Okay. It's a woman after 50 years. She had an accident. She got an injury. And she would like to function how she did before the accident. That's the most common phenomenon for all patients. If I didn't have headaches, I want to be like when I didn't have migraines or something like this. If I want to be like I was before. You have to keep in mind, you can never be like you were before. Anyone who has that model is incorrect. You can only be better than you are now. The future you can be. You cannot be what you were before. She had PT many times. It was unsuccessful. Even though she loved her physical therapist, it never improved. He gave her many exercises. None of them seemed in the long term. She always felt more pain. Well, we then used muscle feedback to show what happens to our muscle. And this is the most enlightened. So here we have breathing, the top line, that's the purple one. The other one is also, the lower one is our muscle tension in our pectoralis or area, pectoralis. And notice it was quite quiet within reason. And then I lift the arm and let it plop. So for a moment, lift the arm and let it plop. And what do you notice is it doesn't come back. It doesn't come back. Here, notice lift it again. Plop. It doesn't come back. Well, that's like your knee. No one ever taught her to just let it go. That was the core of her therapy. Okay. When the tension stays up, there's a trouble. And thus, for this woman, doing exercise could only make it worse because she would use the arm for an exercise, but the muscle never quite relaxed. And you cannot see that usually. So the EMG makes them invisible, visible. And also it can show how the mind and body connects. So here the therapist now described her experience. This is developing a yes set. So basically the therapist said, gosh, this is what happened. It's because the muscle, and you could just see the person saying yes. And when they said yes, look how the muscle relaxed. So this can also be a remarkable tool in therapy to monitor when you are correct. This is when the person's vigilance drops. They feel understood. And sometimes EMG can be remarkably done that way. I've only touched on a few subjects of EMG. The major concepts to think about are dysphonesis, help identify the misdirections. 2, every thought has a body experience. Does thoughts affect body? EMG is a very powerful tool to show that. 3, many people think they are relaxed or that muscle is relaxed, and they're not. 4, pain has at least 2 components often. People who have pain and muscle activity. 1, the muscle does not relax after activation. That's the critical one. 2, there's inappropriate co-contraction. And 3, that the trigger points are activated, and that is the emotional side. So now you need to learn to really get quiet emotionally and feel safe to reduce the trigger point activity. And finally, most people are totally unaware, and so are therapists, that the muscles are slightly tightening. So for me, EMG is a remarkable tool for assessment. And for clients, they can now actually train. They can look at the screen and see they're doing it correctly or not. And some of the people, if they're intrigued, I'll put it into the chat as well. I mean, I have a number of articles which were turned into blogs, which do with electromyography. So people just go down my blog and find some where there would be physiological recordings as well to demonstrate that, or contact me. I would say I cannot conceive any physical therapist, any OT, not using biofeedback, because it's like an X-ray or an MRI for the body. And I would say any psychologist who is doing EEG ought to be doing electromyography first to teach the person to relax, especially the scalp, because so often we have so many muscle artifacts when recording. So teach the person first to relax and practice at home during the day to master that skill. But partly if you relax your face and neck and shoulders, often you quiet the brain as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I even think about it, if you were doing like optimal performance, you have to make sure whether you're doing it right, so you're not over activating your muscles and causing potential injury
Well,
and
there are
such.
two of those for peak
Mhm.
performance. One is the inhibition of muscle activities you don't need, you should not be using, co-contractions. Two, it's the ability to recover right away, to
Mhm.
drop to zero right away. That's two. That's two. And three, in an article, one of the articles we published with where the person got the gold medal in weightlifting, when she used mental imagery, when she did imagery, her muscles didn't react, so she was wasting her time till she learned how to do imagery that activated her muscles at the same time. And so you can use that as well. So when you give people homework practice in psychotherapy, where they're doing mental rehearsal, which is often very useful, then you want to monitor those muscles which should be involved in the task. And if you see they're doing mental rehearsal and there's no motor activity in those muscles, you're wasting your time from my perspective. So then you have to teach the person first to allow that connection by maybe actually physically role playing till they feel it and make that connection, and then use the imagery to do your task training. And that we wrote up in an article of the weightlifter.
That's very interesting. It almost reminds me of like back when I was in high school and I used to do basketball, they would say like practice your free throws in your
Yes.
mind after you've like done it over and over and over. So
And if you do
it's
that,
really
when you're in your
interesting.
imagination, if you did the free fall throw, you would see that if you monitor the anterior deltoid, that you would go up, right? The
Mhm.
activity would increase. And so if you were sitting quietly, and now I put the EMG on the anterior deltoid, and you now practice free flow, I would expect a little, when you're doing it, a little increase, not much. Some people, you can see the body almost move, but for some people, there's no activity. If there's zero activity, stop doing it till they can get the corresponding motor activity with that. So I think for psychotherapy, for training, this is a critical tool to demonstrate that imagery is working, or that you need to work at a step before it to make that connection first.
Thank you, Dr. Pepper, for being here and for your presentation. And then goodbye, everyone. I'll see you guys at another time.
Thanks, Eunice.
Oh, no problem. Bye.